I've always enjoyed my Sunday visits with Grandpa. He wasn't able to take care of himself anymore, so the family had him moved into a retirement community. Being an independent person, Grandpa had made a big fuss about moving in at first. However, once he started to get to know the other residents and learned about all the activities that went on at the home, he felt a little better about being there. After Grandpa moved in, I would visit him every Sunday and join in on the weekly game challenge. The game changed depending on the week. Sometimes it was Jim Rumney, others times it was shuffleboard, sometimes it was bingo. The games were chosen ahead of time by the residents from a list that had all the available games written on it. When the game was decided upon, the entire hall would be converted into an arena for the game of choice. This week, the residents had chosen to play backgammon, admittedly not one of my favorites. After we played a few rounds of this weekly game, Grandpa and I would get some lunch at the retirement home dining hall and then head back into his room so that he could tell me one of his favorite stories. Grandpa told a lot of stories about gnomes, fairies, giants, and other supernatural creatures. He even told me about the urban legends like the alligators living under the sewer he had heard while growing up in New Jersey. It was always great fun hearing Grandpa's stories, and I always looked forward to hearing a new one every week. The years passed, and I entered high school. I didn't stop by to visit Grandpa as often anymore because I became busy with hanging out with friends, doing homework, and starting to date girls for the first time. Even though I didn't have the same amount of free time as I had when I was younger, I would still try and visit Grandpa as often as I could and join in on the Sunday games. I would have lunch with Grandpa and listen to one of his tall tales when we went back to his room. I was older, but still loved listening to the stories. It seemed like he would never run out of subjects to talk about. He even told me about his experience as a pilot in World War II. It was always great fun listening to the trouble he got into as a pilot, flying underneath billboards to see how low he could make his personal plane that he had bought after the war ended. Finally, it came time for me to go off to college. I wouldn't be back for a while, so I wanted to spend a lot of time with Grandpa before I left. I noticed that his health had taken a turn for the worst, but he never brought it up. I never brought it up either because I didn't like to think about the fact that Grandpa's health was fading. I visited him like usual until the last day I had free before the start of the new semester. This would turn out to be a visit that I would never forget. We had our usual schedule, play a game, chat over lunch of all the new things that was going on in the both of our lives, and go back to his room for a cup of coffee, butterscotch cookies, and one of his tall tales. We sat at the table next to one another, dunking our cookies into the hot coffee and eating them one by one. Today, Grandpa seemed very introverted than usual. He hadn't really said much over lunch either. I figured that this was because he was having one of his, quote, bad days, or the days where his bones ached and he had a hard time getting around. However, I didn't think this anymore when I saw Grandpa promptly stop eating the cookies I had in front of him and give me the most serious look I had ever seen give him in his life. I put down my cookies as well and listened to whatever it was Grandpa was about to tell me. He cleared his throat and in a gray tone said, "You're older now, Thomas. You're about to go off to university and experience a whole new chapter in your life. And that's why today I have to give you some advice." I smiled and urged him to go on. Grandpa nodded and continued where he left off. "You are the first person I'm telling this story to. I told myself I would only tell my most devoted grandchild the story in hopes that they would not make the same mistakes I did in life. And you must promise me that you will only tell the story to your most devoted grandchild so that every generation is given a fair warning." Grandpa paused and made sure that I was going to keep the promise. I swore that I would on my life, and then he continued on. You know about your grandmother, don't you? You were only 5 or so when she passed away." At this, he paused. When he saw my expression change a bit, after patting my shoulder for a moment, he went on. "Yes, I miss her too. I always loved her dearly. It's at my old age that I've had a lot of time to reflect on my past actions. I wish that when we were married I could have treated her better. If I had treated her better, maybe she wouldn't have turned out like that." I was taken aback a bit by his statement. "What do you mean?" Grandpa sighed. "That is what I wanted to talk to you about. Some advice I wanted to offer for you as you head off into the world and want to make a life for yourself. You see, your grandmother and I got married in the 50s. In those times, men were king of the houses and their wives had to attend to their every need. I'm not saying it's right, it's just the way that things were back then. I was the same as most men in that era. I was fresh out of the military service from World War II and had just settled down with your grandmother. We bought a cheap house under a government program to encourage home ownership, and I got a job working at an office. Unfortunately, like most men in my era, I was always very hard on your grandmother, who, like most women in the era just stayed at home. I always demanded the best from her. The best housework, the best meals, the best hosting that we had when our neighbors were over. I insisted that she always dress up, wear makeup, and put on her fine jewelry when managing the house. No wife of mine was going to be a slob and get me mocked by the neighbors. Looking back now, I realized how silly I was to demand all of that from her. But I suppose we were both victims of the culture of that time. I think my strictness got to your grandmother at times because there were occasions when I would see her weeping to herself as she made dinner in the kitchen. When she was like that, I would leave her alone. I had tried to suggest that she watch one of her shows on the Women's Network or listen to a cooking show on the radio, but my suggestions always made her more upset. So I'd learned to give her space when she was in one of her moods. However, one night she was so upset that she had burnt our food. Even after burning it, she still served it in both of our dishes at the table and sat down to eat her own portion, still weeping as she shoveled the burnt pieces into her mouth. This was unacceptable to me. I chastised her for what she had done and told her to go back into the kitchen and make a new dinner for both of us. I told her that if she couldn't get herself together to simply make me a sandwich, that ought to calm her down a bit. It was then that something changed in her. Her tears suddenly stopped and a small smile crept across her face. She laughed a bit, and I laughed along too. The whole situation was a bit comical. I apologized for being strict, and she shook the whole thing off. She brought the dishes back to the kitchen and set forth to making me a second meal, which was served for the very second time was up with the usual quality of her cooking. After that incident, your grandmother didn't cry again. She went about happily doing the housework and preparing the meals. When she was chastised, she would simply smile and say she'd do better. She was the model housewife. It was around that time that one of my good friends, Jerry, went missing. Your grandmother knew his wife, Edith, and together they got all the housewives involved in trying to find him. They put up flyers and the like, but unfortunately, Jerry was never seen again. It was a few months later that another one of my friends, Stan, went missing. The housewives got together again and tried to find him with little success. After that, the excitement died down. Although the men were not found, no one else went missing from the neighborhood. It became somewhat of a local mystery. None of the men had a reason to go missing. They just worked at the same office that I did, and they both had stable home lives. Even to this day, the neighborhood is still talking about the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. The incident did bring the community closer together. The housewives ended up forming up their own club, which became a national sorority. It was open for many years, and during that time donated a lot of its time to helping the less fortunate people in the community. I was one of those people who always wondered what happened to Jerry and Stan. They were good friends, and I was always upset to lose them. It was when your grandmother's health was failing many years later that we got to talking about my old-time friends. Here, grandfather paused at the subject as if the subject was hard to talk about. But when he saw my concerned expression, he continued on. Ah, don't worry about me, lad. I'll be fine. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. Many years later, your grandmother and I were talking about Jerry and Stan. And that's when she brought up all the great things she cooked while we were looking for them. The mouth-watering roast she had prepared and fed to all the members of the search party. The roast beef sandwiches she had packed for the lunches I took to the office. The blood pudding she had made for the neighbors. She went on like this, naming off all the different meals she had carved and served to people over the years. I recalled that all of her meals were warm, but was a little bit confusing as to why she had brought it up when I was talking about my old friends. And that's when the smile came over her face. That same smile that came over her face at the dinner table those many years ago. An unsettling kind of grin that seemed to reach in and tug at my very soul. "They've already been cooked, dear," she said in a crackled, uneven tone. I felt myself retch a bit at the thought of consuming terrible things that I had. Your grandmother just chuckled and continued on. "I cooked them along with all the people you complained about at your job. Remember how you complained about Stan and Jerry getting promoted before you? I took care of that, didn't I? I made sure the supervisors who were bullying you moved away. Of course, they didn't really go anywhere other than my cooking pot. I always made sure to cook a perfect meal out of all the naysayers just for you." Grandpa stopped his tail and retched a bit, and I stared at him with my mouth open. I could feel the color draining from my face. At this point, I was visibly shaken. When he got a hold of himself, he continued on. "Shortly after, your grandmother told me that she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The same creepy smile was plastered on her lips when I found her. After the funeral came and went, her last words haunted me. I wanted to know more. I started reading through her old journals, and I learned that the women's club she had formed, the Jersey White Hat Club, had a very dark practice that they put into place. Should any man give them a hard time, it was not above them to punish them in any way possible. They outlined all the ways they could punish their significant others, boyfriends, or other troublesome men in their lives. There were recipes for poisons, instructions on how to psychologically torture people. There were so many dark things I read in those journals that I didn't even want to repeat them, but one of their most twisted games was taking a friend of the troublesome men in their lives and serving it to him in the form of food. They had all sorts of recipes about cooking and preparing human beings. These journals were some of the most horrible things I had ever read in my life. I would have burned them all if I didn't have to turn them into the police station for evidence. And that's what I did instead. The police read the journals in complete disbelief. I gave them the journals with the specific conditions of keeping my family out of the media and in the investigations. I told them that was the only way I would have handed over the evidence. Since I knew the head of the local police station, he pulled some strings and focused much on the investigation of the living members of the sorority, like your grandmother's best friend, Edith. They investigated the local Jersey White Hat Club and brought in all the current members for questioning. Our family sat in the sidelines watching the whole thing in disbelief. As you know, Edith had been one of our close family friends for years. Everyone was shocked that she was actually a member of such a dark cult. If they knew anything that I do about your grandmother, they would have been even more horrified. Fortunately, that was not the truth that any of them had to bear. Later, the police found out that every chapter of the sorority across the United States was still practicing the dark rituals written in your grandmother's journals. They were able to successfully shut down the sorority 2 years ago, after being active all those years. But I had heard recently A new club started up under a different name. This is the advice I wanted to give you, Sonny. If you ever meet a girl wearing a white opal stone shaped like a moon on her left ring finger, under no circumstances have any relationship with her. Report her in whatever club she's in affiliated with the police. That's their secret calling card. And just to be safe, here Grandpa proceeded to take a bit of a drink of a glass of orange juice sitting beside his coffee to calm his nerves, and then he continued on. Never, I repeat never, mock a girl by asking her to make you a sandwich. Don't demand anything from her. Treat her equal. Let her do as she pleases. If I'd learned to be kinder to your grandmother all those years ago, I wouldn't have created the monster she became. Be kind to the ladies in your life, grandson. The consequences for doing otherwise are dire. And with that, Grandpa fell quiet. His hands were wrapped around the glass and the orange juice for support, but they were visibly shaking. I was shaking too. All of this was too much to take in. I could only sit there staring at my grandfather in silence. Every time words came to my mouth, they quickly left me. The two of us didn't talk for the rest of our visit. I simply got up from the table and walked to my car without another word when it was time to leave. The words of my grandfather's story echoed throughout my mind on the long drive home. 4 years after my visit, and shortly after I received my bachelor's degree, my grandfather passed away. I attended the funeral in the late spring. The whole family was there. My mother, my father, his 2 brothers, my cousins, my sister, and her husband. Of course, the more obscure family members were there too, like my grandfather's sisters, the cousins 3 or 4 times removed, and other assorted relatives. Your standard fare for the typical family gatherings. It was an open casket funeral, so the family could come up and look at him lying peacefully in his new home. I came up and paid my respects. I silently promised my grandfather that I wouldn't tell what I knew to anyone in our family, and thanked him for all the good times we shared. It was then that one of my female cousins came up and paid her respects to Grandpa too. She tried to lighten the mood a bit by teasing me about finding a girlfriend. I told her that I was in no hurry to find one, and she rolled her eyes. As she went to talk to the other family members, I got the sight of something white on her finger. My heart started beating loudly in my chest at the sight of it. It was an opal stone cut in the shape of a moon. She wore it on her left ring finger. My eyes shot around the rest of the room. My aunt wore the ring. My female cousins wore the ring. My grandfather's sisters wore it as well. Even my mother wore it. My head started spinning as I realized that all the female members in the family wore the same ring. I felt my heart pounding louder and louder in my chest. My grandfather had made a big mistake not getting our family involved in the investigation. This thought washed over me as I saw more family members enter the funeral home, wearing the infamous ring, and the walls felt more and more like they were slowly closing in on me.